All right, welcome to Service APIs meeting for February 3. We have a relatively light agenda today, so I think we'll have plenty of time to get through everything. I wanted to start off with just another reminder. Last week, we brought up the idea, I think Bowie had filed an issue early last week, and we discussed it at the last meeting about potentially renaming the project. The initial suggestion was gateway APIs. Since following through the thread, it transitioned to gateway API, and a bit more conversation on there. I went through and sent it out to Signet mailing list. There hasn't been a lot of feedback, but what we have gotten has been positive. I also have an agenda item tomorrow at SIG Network community meeting to bring this up to the larger group there. But before we go any further, I wanted to give an opportunity for anyone here to voice opinion. Does this seem like a reasonable change? Is a name change just painful at this point? Are there better names? Should we just not bother, etc.? Anyone have any feedback, hesitation about this potential change?
Hey Rob, it's Nick. I'm back.
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I really like it. I think it makes more sense. It's a bit less confusing for people.
Cool. That's great to hear. Yeah, that seems to be the constant thread we're getting. I mean, what we'd seen internally as we'd had some users testing this is they would naturally refer to this as the gateway API just because they were using the gateway resource, right? So I think this will be a good change and something like that is easier to map the resources to the name, and also a unique name in the relatively unique name in the Kubernetes ecosystem. Great. Okay, so another thing that came out of last week is we said we should talk at SIG Network community meeting and agree that we should add support for namespace params. And if we could get the support in upstream, we would do it in service APIs as well. It seems like we have support in upstream at this point. So this, I created a PR that adds this KEP. Obviously, KEP is half of the battle. The other half is actually getting an implementation in. But this would add an optional namespace param, an optional namespace field to the params ref and ingress class. And it seems like we have enough buy-in here that it's likely reasonable to also work towards the same thing for service APIs. So Danian, I think you're the one who originally raised this idea, and it was specific to a contour use case for gateway class. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I've got a PR that's on hold, so I can go ahead and update that. But do we want to wait for this KEP to merge before?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. The KEP deadline is Feb 9. I think it's Tuesday, if I'm remembering correctly. So this has already had at least an LGTM and seems reasonably close. There are some interesting comments in here that I want to surface in a little bit, but I think this is reasonably close. So I would say once this merges, we should try and fit this into service APIs as well, or maybe gateway API by that point. Let me actually jump ahead here and add this. I think this would be a good addition to try and get in as part of a 0.2 release. Does that seem reasonable, Danian, as one thing to aim for 0.2?
I think so.
Cool. This also brought in, so I made the mistake of doing what we're doing in service APIs, which is, unfortunately, it turns out not what the API conventions say we should do. So in my mind, namespace as an empty string was indistinguishable from being empty or nil. And so I said, well, we don't need a pointer. That's been our logic in service APIs. But I was correctly corrected here that the API conventions doc does make it very clear that we should be using pointers for any optional field, even if they are not strictly necessary. So I've changed that here, and I feel like we should probably change that in our own API. Is anyone particularly tied or invested in how we're handling empty values or optional fields?
Rob, I read through this conversation that you're showing here, and I felt like there was just one piece that's missing that we're doing, and that is the defaulting. Unless I missed it in the conversation, it seems like we, unless I'm missing something, if you want to pull up the code, to me, when a parameter is optional and we're not defaulting, we are using a pointer. But it's when we're saying, okay, we're not specifying the parameter is optional, so it's required, and it's we're using the omit empty JSON tag. We're saying that we're not actually specifying that these fields are optional when we default it. We're just saying that it's it can be omitted from JSON.
Yeah, you're completely right. I think we may not have been completely consistent there, but that is reminding me that a lot of this discussion came from how we handle fields that have defaulting implemented with CRDs, because there's not really a similar concept. Like you don't have a default annotation in core types, but that does seem like a very significant difference. So maybe an action item out of this is we need to have some kind of even internal API conventions for this project, which are basically this, but in addition, that clear definition that when we have a default value specified, we should not be using a pointer type because the field is not optional. We don't consider the field optional at that point.
Yeah, I would say when we're using kube builder defaulting or API defaulting, it would be a bug if there is the plus optional tag. So it's probably worth doing a quick audit of the code for to start off with just that plus optional tag, and just verify, like, if it's optional, we shouldn't have a default, and we should have the JSON omit empty. And it should be a pointer, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And then actually, Danian, I don't know if you happen to have any time for this, but is that something like you're able to look into a little bit further?
Yeah, let me make a note of it, and I'll just do a quick audit on it. And is there somewhere that we want to document what we're talking about, or?
I think we should. I think we have grown enough as a project that it would be good somewhere in our documentation. We have like developer documentation that says we follow the Kubernetes API conventions, plus these other things that are slightly unclear from the Kubernetes API conventions. Which right now, the only thing I can think of is this specific example of how we handled fields with a default value.
Yeah, let me work on a PR that updates the documentation. Like I said, I'll go through and audit all the optional fields and make sure that we're not defaulting and that we are including that it's a pointer and we've got the omit empty JSON tag.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. The other the other takeaway that I thought was interesting from the discussion on this KEP, I think Harry brought this up, is that this KEP actually requires a change to the type, right? We're using, let me actually look at the files change because that'll be easier to understand. But we actually have to change from typed local object reference to an entirely new object reference struct. Apparently I messed up indentation, whoops. But this is what we had to switch to. And this is a breaking Go API change. And so there was some conversation about, is that something that we're okay with inside Kubernetes? And I think, Harry, you brought this up. And it sounds like this is, although not ideal, something that is acceptable and something like we have seen multiple times in minor Kubernetes releases. The reason I bring this up is because we had in our service APIs project decided not to make breaking Go API changes until V1 Alpha 2. I think this could be a compelling reason not to wait for that. Harry, you were involved in this conversation. Is that kind of the take you got as well?
Yeah, that's a good summary, I think. So yeah, I think since we are also following semantic, like Go module semantic versioning and properly versioning the modules, I think it's okay to like follow upstream, right, and break Go API changes. Although we should minimize as much as possible, right? But
Yeah.
it should be okay to do it.
Yeah. So that we had one PR, I think it was actually from you that I'll bring up later, that was a breaking Go API change, and we just put a hold on it until V1 Alpha 2. But I think we can revive that based on the feedback here.
And probably renaming things is a breaking change as well. So
yeah, but I think renaming things is a breaking. Yeah, renaming things is a breaking API change regardlessly, but renaming Go types is acceptable. Or maybe that's what you were saying. Like we could rename Go type. Yeah, exactly. Cool. And so, okay. And I just added this note. I just took this KEP on because I wanted to see it get in, but I don't have to own this. This is a relatively straightforward KEP. It is adding an optional field. I mean, there's a little bit more to it than that. So if anyone else is interested in contributing to Kubernetes, this is a KEP that I'm not tied to. So if anyone wants to volunteer for this, I'm happy to hand it off. So just let me know if you're interested in it. Yeah. I will warn anyone that despite this being a single field addition, it will be a 4 release KEP. Anytime you add a field, the way it's feature gated, everything like that, it's basically a year-long commitment to follow through with a KEP like this. Yeah. Okay, from there, I wanted to cover any PRs or issues that we should try and get in 0.2. The last meeting, we agreed that we could release a 0.2.0 release of the API sometime in the first half of February. And we're in February, hurrah. That means we basically have 10-ish days to hit this target. So based on that, I wanted to revisit some of the things that we could potentially target for this release. I think a key one is just that PR I was talking about earlier. It's a relatively small change, but it basically inlined the route forward to type, which I think that's instead of duplicating this everywhere, an inline seems to make sense to me.
Isn't that what the lava lamp was saying, that it's better to actually copy them rather than inline them? In that
That's fair.
In that other issue, just like the other PI you showed and on the cap.
Yeah.
I think the trade-off there is that if you do inline them, it means you can't change them anymore, right? Like the closer we get to stable, the more upstream stuff that you've inlined, you can't do anything with it because then it's breaking API change. And so using the upstream one lets you like piggyback off any stuff that's added to the upstream one, but it means that you can't add anything of your own. You can't change it without it being a breaking API change.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think this is, so I think we should reach some kind of consensus here. As I remember this, and Harry, feel free to correct me on this, but my understanding here is we have a generic route forward to type that we're using for every route except for HTTP route. And the reason we're not using it for HTTP route is because HTTP route has filters. So we have one additional field in this type. And so what Harry did with this PR, was working towards with this PR, was inlining that kind of shared set of fields that every forward to should include. And then you'd still be able to add fields on top of that because it's an inline type, right? So we still have the same core across every route. We just are able to add things. Is that where you were going with this, Harry?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Tim actually raised a concern here that if we are embedding types, we should ensure that that generic type makes sense in all cases, right? Like we do not want a situation where one field of that type should not be present in other use cases, which I don't think is the case here. But that was a good point.
Yeah, I think in this case, it makes sense to either not share forward to type at all and just re-implement this for every single route type, or alternatively do what we're doing here and share the base set of fields for every forward to in each route and then build on that with additional fields as we see fit per route. I don't know. I get that it's a slippery slope.
I think it's pretty reasonable as long as there's like we probably need some documentation there to say for the inlined thing to say this struct is inlined, don't add fields to it, like unless you've checked that those fields are required for every usage of the inline struct.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, you can see what we're removing here. It's the service, the backend ref, the port, and the wait. And thus far, this has been kind of the shared baseline of forward to. It is interesting to try and think of a forward to that could potentially not include any of those fields. But I'm not aware of any. I would say we should be very careful with adding anything to a type that is shared across resources.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to use this pattern, then I think we just need to have a standard way to say this is an inline type, and an agreement that for inline types you don't add fields without, like, making sure that lots of people review it.
Yeah. Bo, you added wouldn't conformance tests fail? Oh, right. Yeah, if people made changes here. I don't know that our conformance tests wouldn't necessarily test our types, our API types, would they? It would be testing behavior of controllers. Unless I'm missing.
Yeah, so we could have tests that say don't add fields to this, I guess.
Yeah.
That would be definitely a way to codify that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Well, just at the very least, I think we can unhold this. That doesn't mean we should do it, but it does mean we should revisit conversation on this, and try to make sure that what we're doing here either makes sense or doesn't make sense and close it. But we're no longer blocked on this being a breaking change for the Go API. So pull 476. All right. The other thing that I wanted to add, I think, Damien, you're looking into this, but just to make sure that we are actually using pointers consistently for optional fields. I feel like we may have missed that in at least one place, but I'm not sure. The other thing that I think would be a nice stretch goal, though this is a significant amount of work, I'm sure, but it seems like it would be nice if we did move forward with this rename, to actually try and get the rename in place as part of this v0.2 release, because then it makes it much easier to target Gateway API at 0.2.0, and the transition becomes relatively straightforward, instead of messing up a name change after this. And the later we change a name, the more painful it is. Similarly, the namespace params ref, I think, is something like that will happen. At least we'll get the KEP merged in before we need to make a release for ingress class, before we need to make a release for 0.2.0. So I'd like to get that in as well. Is there anything else we can think of that should go in to 0.2 that I haven't mentioned here?
I mean, doc changes don't necessarily need to be like included in there, but I think we have like 2 or 3 good PRs that if we can bundle it with it, it provides sort of a forcing function to get us to review and finally merge it in.
Yep.
Webhook is another one where we like it's pretty early on, but if we could actually get to it, that would be, I think it would be a stretch goal though.
Yeah, I think both webhook and conformance tests are things that can kind of continue to iterate outside of the normal release cycle at this point, but it would be nice. It would be nice, and it does feel awfully close. I went ahead yesterday and actually installed the webhook, and it feels relatively close. There was an issue related to a logging config change recently, but things like the cert were automatically provisioned, and it seemed like it was awfully close. So Chris wasn't able to, had a conflict for this meeting, but I know he's still working on it, and I think we'll be close to getting that in. Yeah. Great points. Okay. Anything else for v0.2? Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to move on then to this awesome little gist that Matej put together. He's new to service APIs, gateway API, whatever, and really appreciate this. He wrote out some feedback on this route binding relationship that I thought would be really helpful. So maybe I'll just hand it off to Matej, and you can provide, as you read through this, what you thought of as you were trying to understand this API.
Right. Hello, everyone. Super excited to speak and to meet you all. So this is my second service API meeting. And in the first one, there was a lengthy conversation on the gateway and route relationship documentation. And I think it was towards the end that Rob suggested people who are new can offer some feedback. And, you know, since I'm new and eager to participate, I thought I could give it a try. So I'm just gonna cut straight to the chase here. I do want to say before I start though, that I'm fairly inexperienced. So I just graduated from university and I don't work with Kubernetes in my day-to-day. So I thought, you know, if I can understand the documentation, then most people who will work with this probably will get it. Yeah, it took me about 30 minutes to go through the whole documentation and to just kind of wrap my head around the concepts without, you know, hearing about gateway classes or route objects before. The thing that stood out to me the most as being confusing was the route binding section. And I think the issue that I kind of found here is that the first few sentences confused me a little bit about what the relationship between a gateway and a route is. The way I first understood it is that a gateway object would define routes as part of a spec. So it actually took me a while to kind of find out that that's not the case. I even went to the API docs, to the actual code documentation to see how the spec is defined. This made it a bit harder for me to just kind of follow through with the provided example and the gateway and route relationships that were outlined. So it was all just a bit lost on me. But I think the summary did a great job at explaining everything in simpler terms. So my main feedback for this point was that probably the route binding section can just be simplified a little bit just by rewriting what's in the summary to be the introduction and to set the scene. And I think to this point, one of the comments in the PR, because I just went to look at the PR after reading through the documentation, one of the comments was that a more top to bottom approach, first explaining how a gateway selects a route and how a route exposes itself. And then finally what binding means would be a bit more beneficial. And in a way, I kind of agree with that because after reading through it all, I think binding to me made sense just at the end. And even now I'm still a bit confused, but basically what it means to me is that a route exposes itself and a gateway selects it. So that's kind of how you would define binding as a relationship. And I think that's kind of what I came up with when it comes to route binding. If Rob, can you please scroll down? The next section was the actual route selection, and I think this is where the debate took place in last week's meeting. I think most of it was related to the selector. In all honesty, to me, the section was pretty straightforward. Both this and the route expose section, to me, both of them were pretty straightforward. I could understand everything that's in there. I think if I did have to be nitpicky, the selector definition that we had on there kind of threw me off a little bit, just because there was a lot of namespace definitions involved in there. Just talking about namespace is a bit too much. But I think the one thing that worked for me with the example is that the label selector is kind of a Kubernetes concept that everyone who would probably work with this type of stuff would know. So to me, it actually made it easier to make this association. And in last week's meeting, I think somebody mentioned that the way we have that expose label in the example might throw people off. But I think to me, it actually worked the other way around. It helped me understand a bit better exactly what's being targeted by the selector, so a route in this case, and how everything comes together. So yeah, really great work on the examples. I don't know how the documentation looked before this was added in, but I think the addition of examples definitely helped. And then I think that's kind of the gist of it. I'm definitely forgetting a few things, but all in all, I think additional examples are not going to hurt. But I know probably, you know, being a bit more conservative in documentation and trying to emphasize stuff more, you know, having extra examples might just take a bit from that and provide a bit of clutter. But all in all, I think the main point, the main struggle that I had personally was just kind of defining this binding relationship. And I think if we do a better job at first of setting the expectations of what binding means, it's going to help down the line to really synthesize for the examples and get everything I hope that made sense, and I'm not going on a tangent here, but that's pretty much it.
Matei, I was gonna say thank you for the feedback. This is really good, and it's really good to have a new user go through it so we can understand kind of what things we've assumed here. A couple things. So I was kind of just going to pull the group. I've noticed a couple different patterns about how users want to think about their the relationship between routes and gateways. There is one customer I talked to that basically they wanted to. It's kind of about who should own the mappings of gateway to route. And there's one infrastructure team that basically they'll have a couple different gateways, and the infrastructure team wanted to own the mapping. So they decide which routes, which bind to which gateways. So the app team just basically creates a route with no awareness of which gateway it binds to. And that's decided by the infra team based on, which team it is or which app it is. They have that knowledge and they hold that mapping. Other teams are looking at basically they want to provide some gateways and then allow the application owners to select themselves which gateways they bind to. And I kind of feel like those are like two different camps of thought there, because in one case you'd want to you just use different controls to do it. I'm not sure if anyone else sees it that way. Maybe that might be a useful example to start with, to kind of discuss like what are the relationships between the infrastructure team and the app team, and where the boundary is on how much the app team controls or doesn't control. That might put this in context better, but I want to see if everyone else kind of sees it that way as well.
We've definitely.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say we've definitely had requests for that sort of thing on Contour, so I think it's that so for some teams the infrastructure team absolutely wants to be the only ones who get to say which things bind to the gateway, and for some teams they want it to be magic so that the people who are creating routes can just bind anything they like. And I think we've done a good job in designing the API that you can do that. It does make it harder to explain though. Sorry, Matei, over to you.
No, I just wanted to say that what you said, Mark, I think this would help me visualize it a bit better. Just thinking of the experience I had today, I think that would be a good idea.
Okay, cool. I will. I'll come up with just a little bit of discussion about kind of relationships about teams and organizational structure, and we can slide that in. Matei, I'll send over PR and definitely CC you on there for feedback once I get that ready, probably within the next couple weeks.
Cool, this is awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Matei. This is exactly what we need. I know that I felt we were struggling with getting route binding correct, and then even if we had it correct, explaining it well enough. And Mark helped a lot, but just getting some fresh eyes on this and getting this great written feedback on what might still be confusing has been very helpful. So yeah, thanks a bunch, and welcome as well.
Thank you, and my pleasure.
Cool. All right, let's move on to just a couple last things. One thing came in Slack this morning, asking if we wanted to provide a standard set of metrics as part of this API spec. And in this case, it was I think Jonathan who mentioned it. I'm not sure if he's on this call. Don't see him. But he had specifically asked if we wanted to have metrics for things like number of successful requests. He specifically referred to SMI metrics, and the spec that is included there for, I think they have 5 standard metrics that they include as part of the spec. I know we've had some offhand discussion about potentially including metrics here. It feels a little bit, I don't want to say out of scope, but not our primary focus to me. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't, it doesn't mean it needs to be out of scope. So I just wanted to bring this up and see if anyone was interested in exploring this area further as part of this project, or just any thoughts on kind of a generic set of metrics that we could try and standardize on. To go a bit further, Harry, I'm not sure if you were about to say anything, but to go a bit further, or go ahead. Sorry, Harry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, this was specific to auto scaling, right? And if as an example, implementations of this API provided sufficient metrics, and in a standardized enough way, you could provide much more meaningful auto scaling based on those kind of consistent metrics. So that is a compelling reason to think about something like this. But we obviously have a lot to focus on, as part of this API design. I don't want to lose focus unless this is, a really compelling area to work on in the next few months.
Feels to me like it might be useful at some point, but it's down the list past a lot of other stuff.
Yeah. That's about where I land on this. I certainly don't want to rule it out. I can see great value in a standardized set of metrics. To me at least, we have higher priority items that are closer to our core purpose, and this feels like it's kind of on the edge of that core purpose.
I guess the other thing I would say is that it feels to me like if we did implement this, it would be one of the outer layers of conformance. Anyway, like you're not going to have this in the core.
Yeah, agreed.
And it feels to me like we should focus. Sorry, you go, Harry.
Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, all I was going to say is, we should fill out the core, the core before we start worrying too much about putting optional stuff in. Is there anything else I was going to say?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, well, what we could do is we do want implementers to sort of play around in the custom conformance area. So we should definitely encourage implementers to try building something in at least one implementation, and then just so that other implementers can keep an eye on that and see, okay, if that's of value, they can sort of mirror that or something. And then that's how we can get more and more things into the extended and core.
Right. You're saying that that this API leaves plenty of room for kind of implementation specific experimentation that can eventually lead to additions to core.
Right. So, I mean, if, the folks in CADA want to do it, please go ahead and do it with the current API surface, and then we'll consider it in future to adopt it inside.
Yeah, that makes sense. Good point. All right, let me move on to PR and issue triage. We don't have a whole lot. Oh, that's cool. That has come in the past little bit, other than the pointers that I already addressed, the change to repo name, and yeah, what do you know, schedule of the next intermediate release. I can say I personally have been pretty distracted with kep freeze in upstream, and hope to get more involved in this and make some more concrete contributions in the next couple of weeks. But with that said, there are a couple things that have potentially gotten stuck. This PR, I don't think anyone is on the call for this one. We've discussed it previously, and I think our last consensus here is that we just are hoping for something that could be as portable as possible and not tied to any one implementation. And I don't think there have been many updates since that. Then for the other one, the route status Go docs, I think this one is, Damien, remind me. Oh, yeah, you just commented on this. What's the current status of this? I lost track of it.
Yeah, I had a chance to go through the comments, and what I settled on is that instead of defaulting a gateway status condition for the different supported route types, we just update the documentation, Go docs, to state an empty gateway list for route status indicates the route has yet to be admitted. So that's the update that I did to this PR, and that's where we're at.
Do you think as a follow-up it makes sense to require at least one condition to be set in this kind of route gateway status struct? Or what sorry, yeah. I've got to look at the diff again, but inside route gateway status, there is a gateway ref and a list of conditions, a slice of conditions. Does it make sense to require that at least one condition is specified for every entry in that list?
That makes sense to me, Rob, because we should, or because if your controller has touched it enough to actually want to add something there, it must have the admitted condition.
Right. Like, to me, it doesn't make sense to ever have an entry in this list with just a gateway ref and no conditions. That feels entirely wrong. So adding a validation, a min length validation, feels like it would go along with this well, because I know your initial goal here was to provide a meaningful default. So we didn't end up with a lack of status here. I think at least requiring a condition to be set helps us get to that point. So we know that when a controller sets something, it's going to include a value, a condition.
I would say if we do that, though, it should above where if Daniel does add that, then it needs to have the thing there saying the minimum condition is the admitted condition, like a condition of type admitted.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So
Daniel?
Yeah,
How do you feel about that, man?
No, I think that makes sense.
so to clarify, what we're discussing here is we're suggesting adding a min length to this conditions slice of 1, and then updating this Go doc to, instead of suggesting the admitted condition, requiring the admitted condition.
I'm thumbs up on that. Yep, I'm
Okay.
thumbs up on that for sure.
Cool.
Okay, I could just go ahead and update this to add those changes as well. I think that makes sense.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, just ping me whenever you've done that, because I know I've been a bit slow to review this PR, so I'll follow up pretty quick. Cool. Yeah, conformance tests. I do intend to revisit this. I've had some offline discussions, discuss this more with Alejandro and folks from Ingress Controller Conformance repository as well, because obviously my initial take on conformance tests, although similar and although sharing some code, inherently did not use Godog, so it used a slightly different framework. It just used vanilla Go tests. It is entirely possible to transition to Godog if we want to, and I've gotten to the point where I think it's at least reasonable for me to spin out a proof of concept with what these same tests would look like with Godog. And that's taken a bit of time to get to, but I'm at least going to explore that further. I outlined, I don't want to spend forever on this because I know we've already discussed this in previous meetings, but I did outline a variety of reasons for avoiding the use of Godog in this initial POC, but I will at least explore it a bit further and try to get something working with it. We'll see. But I want to at least provide examples of what this looks like. Again, just vanilla Go tests, and then separately with a framework like Godog, like what we're using for ingress control to conformance, and see if there's some middle ground we can reach here. These approaches are fairly similar, so I don't think it's going to take a lot of effort. There's just some code gen and additional work with Godog that I'll need to work through. But not much in the way of updates beyond that. I think there's plenty of work that I could do to clean up this, and I appreciate the comments and initial feedback on that. But just as an update here, I'm actually also, in parallel to this, exploring another approach that would use Godog. I'm still not completely sold on it, but I want to at least show what that would look like. And if anyone has any strong feelings on how to structure conformance tests, I'm certainly all ears. But cool. And then the next one's editorial pass over API docs. This one has gotten stuck. I'm not sure. I know we've had a lot of conversation on this one. James ended up pulling out and simplifying a great deal of this PR. But I think there's still a little bit left. I think this PR has gotten a little stale, unfortunately. The fundamental conflict in this PR is just whether we want to prioritize sane-looking Godoc or reasonable-looking Markdown, right? And so one of the very frustrating problems with the current documentation generator is that if you specify something like as simple as an asterisk, it's not going to escape that for Markdown. And so you end up in this fun place where you get bold content in random places, which it just doesn't make sense, right? And so this PR as it exists right now replaces asterisks in Godoc with this HTML escape character, which sure, it looks a lot better in the Markdown and in our reference doc, but becomes remarkably confusing if you're just looking at the Go types.
Does that mean that if we're going to prioritize the Go docs, which I'm 100% fine with, then doesn't that mean that we probably should just stop supplying the types themselves on the thing and just have a pointer to the Go docs?
Okay, I see what you're. So instead
I
of
pointed
having,
at package.go.dev, which is going to parse that stuff properly anyway, and then rather than having that embedded in our website, like just saying for the types, head off to package.go.dev. I don't know. Yeah,
no, I mean that's a good point. It's frustrating because there are some really nice things about the generated reference docs. I mean it does structure things very nicely, and it does embed in our code quite well, in our website quite well. It's just these kind of relative edge cases where it starts to get frustrating to deal with.
Yeah, I've been using them a lot as a reference rather than using the the Go packages themselves, or the Go
Yeah.
or package.go.dev as well. Yeah, it's because it's easier to read and it's easier to jump around. But
Yeah, it is.
yeah, because there's less. It's just the details of what points to what. It's much more useful for if you're not doing Go implementation and you're doing a YAML. You just, how do I write the YAML?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree. They're awesome. I'm a big fan of them. I wish we could find a way, really, I wish we could find a way to update the generator to escape special characters. But I recognize that is a significant amount of work, or I'm assuming it is. I'm not that familiar with the generator we're using. Because, whenever given a choice, I'd always prefer to just have both. But right now, if it's a decision between breaking Go docs or breaking our reference docs, I would rather not choose either. I would rather fix the generator. But I know that's not trivial. Does anyone else have a preference for what we do here?
As I've already posted in the PR, I think Go docs should take preference, and then we can subsequently fix the generator. So that's a preference. That's all.
That makes sense to me. I mean, we are still alpha. We do have time. But yeah, I would say that we should consider it a reasonably close to a hard requirement to have, to have either the generator fixed or to not have the things on there, because it is confusing at the moment. In some ways, these edge cases are weird and make it less readable.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I guess what we need as a follow-up out of this is some kind of investigation in how difficult it would be to escape these characters in the code gen. Reference doc generation. And related to that, if we deem that too difficult, then you're probably right. We should just link to Go docs directly until we can fix the generated docs, because as useful as they are, it is unfortunate that some of these edge cases render so poorly. It feels like we're so close to. I know James has fixed so many things about the generated reference docs. Yeah. Okay. Or go ahead, Nick.
I was going to say, yeah, that sounds good to me, is all I was going to say.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go ahead and add a follow-up comment on this one just to try and summarize what we said here. I think if I'm interpreting correctly, we really want to ensure GoDoc remains readable and accurate as our top priority, but we also really value the reference doc as it exists and would like to see generation fixed to escape characters, whatever it takes to make that work as well. Because if that code generation were working as it could, it would be better than, or more readable than package.go.dev or anything else like that. Yeah. Okay. I think that's just about all. The webhook I've already covered. That's awfully close. I added a few more comments for Chris, tested this out, and it feels really close. We've gone through deduplicating types, and I think we've gone through the request retry attributes recently enough. We do need to, earlier on in a meeting a few weeks ago, I outlined some priorities for what we should be working on in the next few months. Right now, those priorities have been defined as webhook and conformance tests and kind of the non-API things, as I imagine a lot of us are working on implementations for this API, but we also, in the not too distant future, need to start thinking about additions to the API again, things that are currently notable additions, such as request retry and timeout that this PR initially targeted back in the day. So I don't know that we need to focus on them quite yet. I think there's plenty to do on conformance and webhooks, but if you're thinking about gaps in the API that really should be filled soon, I think we should start to transition back to that additive phase soon. Yeah, I think that's all I have. Are there any opens? It looks like we blew through the time. Anything I missed to cover?
I just had something I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
I've got the Contour Service API's implementation design is almost done. Once we've got our design doc for that up, do you want me to just drop it in the channel? Should I come and talk about it here? What would you all like me to do? I think there's a couple of things that are interesting about our implementation that it's probably worth me explaining.
Yeah, I would say all of the above. One of my goals in short term is to provide a page that links to implementations and progress on implementations. I don't know if a design doc is the appropriate thing or a tracking issue for Contour, but
yeah, we do have a tracking issue, so I can link to that as well. But yeah, but I'll send you all the design doc once I've got it. Once I've got our design accepted in what we're going to do. Yeah, and then I will come along to the next meeting of this and and explain how we've broken up and how the implementation actually works.
Yeah, that's awesome. It would be great to get some more perspectives on this, and especially if it shows any shortcomings of the API, it would be great to surface those ASAP as well. Yeah, very interested in that.
Cool. Yeah, I'll post it in the channel as soon as it's done.
Great, thanks. All right, well, I think that's all for today. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and we'll talk to you on GitHub, Slack, wherever, and next week as well. Have a great one.